For this lecture, we are going to look into lateralization, which is basically looking at the difference between the right and left hemispheres of the brain. We are also going to talk about split brain individuals, and then we will focus on language. Okay, so let's look at the left and right brain. Okay, so for many functions, there are no substantial differences between hemispheres. So I just want to kind of put that out there, that even though you'll see a figure like you do on the screen there where it says left hemisphere, right hemisphere, but remember it says general function. Okay, so there's a lot of shared activity in the brain. So even though one hemisphere might be specialized in something, it doesn't mean that it is completely isolated. That functionality is completely isolated to that hemisphere. Okay, and so that leads us into the key point also. Lateralization of function is statistical rather than absolute. Okay, so it might be that the right hemisphere is more specific for geometric patterns, but it doesn't mean that it's completely dominant for geometric patterns. Left hemisphere, superior and controlling ipsilateral movement. That means movement on the same side of the body. The left hemisphere is also an interpreter. So for the most part, and we'll talk about this a lot, for the most part, the left hemisphere is where our language centers lie, okay? The right hemisphere, superiority, we have spatial ability, we have emotion, musical ability, and then some memory tasks. So I've provided you quite a bit of information here. The table at the bottom, left hemisphere, phonetic, sequential, analytical, linguistic. Okay, most of your language centers left hemisphere. So you'll see those. Again, that's like superiority, right? Right hemisphere, superior for spatial, for form perception, okay, for holistic and non-linguistic items. And then if we look at the figure on the right, okay, specifically for vision, we have words and letters on the left hemisphere. On the right, we have faces, geometric patterns, and emotional expression. For audition, left hemisphere, language sounds, right hemisphere, non-language sounds, but big in music. Okay. Touch, we have right hemisphere, tactile patterns in Braille. For movement, again, left hemisphere, ipsilateral movement, but right hemisphere movement in spatial patterns, again, that spatial perception. For memory, left hemisphere, verbal memory, finding meaning in memories. Right hemisphere, nonverbal memory, perceptual aspects of memories. And then for language, okay, so language, definitely a lot of focus here on the left hemisphere. Speech, reading, writing, arithmetic, okay. On the right hemisphere, we're looking at emotional content. And then spatial ability, it's kind of the reciprocal, huh? So for spatial ability, we see right hemisphere is dominating here. Anything for distance, direction, geometry, mental rotation of shapes, that is very dominant for the right hemisphere, where language is mostly dominant for the left hemisphere. Okay, now let's look at a lot of other issues here on how the left and right brain are different. If we look at the planum temporale, which is the upper surface of the temporal lobe, and that's shown to you in the graphic there by that orangey yellow color, okay? And it is larger in the left hemisphere, even in infants before development of language. So we see here that the left and right hemispheres are definitely different, even from birth. The left hemisphere is more activated in monkeys when they hear other monkey vocalizations than when they hear human speech. So it's they're being built, right? It's innate. It's the way that they were created that that automatically, they cue in on vocalizations that they, as a species, know. Okay, let's look at the auditory areas of the right hemisphere. Okay, so again, the planum temporale here plays a major role in perception of music. So the figure on the left-hand side, you'll see in a musician, the left planum temporale is actually much larger than the non-musicians. So musical perception is impaired by damage to the right hemisphere, and music activates the right hemisphere more than the left. Okay? But perfect pitch relies on left hemisphere mechanisms. And I think that's what we're seeing here with the musicians. Okay, so perfect pitch relies on left hemisphere mechanisms, even though most of that music is processed on the right hemisphere. But for these musicians, you see this larger area. And prosody is the perception of the emotional tone in language, and it is also right hemisphere specific. Now, what about handedness? So left-handedness is influenced by heredity, and left-handed people make up about 20%, about 10% of the population. And similar to right-handers, the left hemisphere is specialized for language in most left-handed people. So for most people, whether you're left or right-handed, your language centers will be in the left hemisphere. However, it doesn't have to be that way, right? Right hemisphere dominance for language is rare, but does happen. But when it does occur, it is more likely to be in a left-handed person. Okay. Now let's look at this. People reliably demonstrate a right hemisphere advantage for processing spatial stimuli. We already talked about this, right? Right hemisphere, very specific for spatial formation. Lesions to areas of the right hemisphere can produce visual spatial impairments. For instance, astereognosis is the inability to recognize objects by touch, and prosopagnosia is the inability to recognize faces, including one's own. So if we look at the figure on the right-hand side, you'll look at the graphs at the bottom. On the left, its left hemisphere is anesthetized, okay? And in those cases, the individual is able to recognize their self, but cannot recognize celebrities. And remember, left hemisphere language centers, so they can't recognize or name these celebrities. On the right side, you have the right hemisphere being anesthetized, okay? And in this case, now they can name those celebrities. They do recognize the celebrities, okay? So the green bar is up there fairly high, but look at where the self is. Here, they have a hard time even identifying their self, okay? And that would lend to prosopagnosia, the inability to recognize faces, including one's own. If we look at this same concept a little bit deeper, it says both hemispheres have some capacity for recognizing faces, but bilateral damage causes complete prosopagnosia, inability to recognize faces. And the fusiform gyrus, which you see there in blue in the graphic, is usually damaged in cases of prosopagnosia. Okay? Acquired prosopagnosia can result from brain damage, but it can also be present at birth, so it can be congenital. And both types may be accompanied by other forms of agnosias, which are inabilities to identify individual items. Okay, now let's talk about a split brain individual. Let's talk about somebody who does not have a complete corpus callosum. Okay, so in some cases, they will actually sever the corpus callosum. As it mentions here, it's normally done due to a last-ditch effort to control epilepsy. Okay, so remember with the epilepsy, the focal points can start in one area of the brain and then they branch out. Okay, so somebody with a generalized epileptic seizure, it will overtake the entire brain, and these can be very debilitating. If we cut the corpus callosum, then that radiation of that neural activity, that repetitive signaling remains to just one hemisphere. So it can actually aid the individual greatly in diminishing their seizures. Okay? However, the result is a split brain individual. And what do we mean by that? Well, behavioral studies of these individuals indicate hemispheric specialization in many processes. So because of cutting the corpus callosum, we can actually look better at hemispheric specialization. Sensory information received on one side of the body is usually processed by the contralateral hemisphere. That's another thing that we were able to learn, was that contralateral nature. So something that comes in through the left visual field is processed by the right hemisphere and vice versa. Studies of split brain individuals to test language function in each hemisphere. So words presented to either visual field demonstrated their ability to verbally report only words presented to the left hemisphere, because the left hemisphere has the language centers in it. And the right hemisphere is mainly for spatial processing with limited linguistic ability. So they had a good idea that left hemisphere was more specialized for language, right hemisphere for spatial processing, but using these split brain individuals as subjects, they were really able to consolidate these theories. So let's look at this graphically. On the left-hand side, you have a control participant. So they have a complete intact corpus callosum, okay? So let's look at the left visual field. You'll see the left visual field is in green. The right visual field is in that purple color, okay? So the left visual field coming into the left eye goes over into the right hemisphere for the most part. Now you also need to pay attention to the dotted lines, okay? So the left visual field, dotted green line going towards the nose, okay? That is going to cross over to the right hemisphere, okay? And then the left visual field, you'll see another green line that goes over to the right eye, and you'll see that that information stays on that same hemisphere. So that will be key as we go through this, okay? But for right now, for a normal individual control participant with an intact corpus callosum, the visual information is coming in from the left visual field and processed by the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere can then send that information over to the left hemisphere for whatever it might need. Okay, so if they were to do an experiment on this, you look at the right portion of the same figure, the control participant. Okay, so now look at the key dotted green line, okay, coming into the retina that crosses over the optic chiasm, goes to the right hemisphere. However, right hemisphere, the occipital lobe says, oh, this is something that I remember. I know the name for this. Let me send it through the corpus callosum to the left hemisphere where the language center is, and then state key. Okay, so that works. We can cover one eye, and that process works because the hemispheres are connected. Now let's look at the split brain participant. So we cover the right eye. The physical energy is the key. Again, only going to the left eye, and then the retina towards the nose and the nasal retina. And then you'll see that passes through the optic chiasm, goes into the right hemisphere. However, it can't pass to the left hemisphere. If that information cannot pass to the left hemisphere, because the corpus callosum has been severed, it can't get to the language centers. So now this individual cannot identify that object by name. Okay. And then let's look at the last one. So you cover the right eye, you show the key, but now the key is to the outside retina. Okay. And so that information is processed straight back to the left hemisphere. Since that information is already in the left hemisphere, then that's where the language center lies, and they can mention key. Okay. What about hemisphere dominance? Well, we can view this through dichotic presentation, okay, which delivers different sounds to each ear at the same time. What we've discovered from this is that right-handed people identify verbal stimuli delivered to the right ear more easily. Okay, so they have a right ear advantage. And then up to 50% of left-handed individuals show a reduced or reversed pattern. Now remember the contralateral effect here, and remember where the language centers are. So right-handed people identify verbal stimuli delivered to the right ear more easily because that's processed on the left side at the bottom, in the left hemisphere. Left-handed individuals show a reduced reverse pattern, so no difference between the ears, or in some cases, a left ear advantage. Okay, so now let's focus on language. So first, the mechanisms of language. They are universal, but the forms must be learned in childhood. Okay, so the phonemes, basic speech sounds, the morphemes, simple units of meaning assembled into words with meaning, or semantics. Okay, these are things that are universal, but have to be learned. The graphic on the right-hand side shows you unfathomable. Okay, that's the word, unfathomable. And if we break that down, the un in there, the un, semantics, that means not. Okay, and then the phoneme for that is the vowel u or the consonant in, so and in. Okay, so basic speech sounds and then the meaning behind those. Words are assembled into meaningful strings according to syntax or rules. That's how we format a sentence. At birth, the babies can distinguish phonemes from any language. And language development depends on exposure during a sensitive period. So these babies up to the point, 1 year, 2 year, 3 years old, this is very, very important for them. They're learning syntax, they're learning basic speech sounds, and they're learning the meaning or the semantics. After this period, language can be learned, but more effort is required and different brain regions are used. For anybody out there who is already an adult and you try to learn a new language, you discover that it is very, very difficult. So what are some of the brain areas for language? Well, first of all, let's look at aphasia, which is an impairment in language ability caused by brain injury, especially in the left hemisphere. Okay, since we're talking language now, we're talking primarily left hemisphere. You see in the figure on the right-hand side, that's going to be the left hemisphere of the brain, right? Because it's pointing to the left. The individual would be pointed towards the left. You also have paraphasia, which is substitution of a word by a sound, incorrect word, or unintended words. And then most patients with aphasia also exhibit agraphia, which is impairment in writing, alexia, impairment in reading, and apraxia, which is motor impairment characterized by difficulty in making sequences of movements. Okay. So we will go over these different brain areas in the subsequent slides. I just wanted to bring it up here so you see this left hemisphere, and you're looking at motor areas. You're also looking at the superior portion of the temporal lobe where Wernicke's area is, and so on. Okay, so let's look at some of those areas that you just saw in that figure a little bit more in detail, and then we'll bring it together in the next slide. Okay, so Broca's area is a region of the left inferior frontal region involved in speech production. Anterior lesions that include Broca's area produce non-fluent aphasia, or what they call Broca's aphasia, which is difficulty with producing speech, but not with comprehension. Okay? Many people with non-fluent aphasia also have hemiplegia, which is paralysis of one side of the body, usually the right side, okay, because it's affecting the left hemisphere. Again, so now you have Broca's area. What about Wernicke's area? Region of the left posterior temporal parietal cortex involved in perception of speech. Okay. But now here we're looking at production of speech. So fluent or Wernicke's aphasia is fluent, meaningless speech accompanied by minimal language comprehension, impaired ability to repeat words or phrases. Okay. So speech production for Broca's area, perception, understanding, comprehension of speech for Wernicke's area. And under the Wernicke's area, we also include anomias, which is the inability to name, inability to name persons or objects. We have word deafness, which is the inability to recognize speech. and word blindness, the inability to read or understand written words. Also, I put in here global aphasia. This is total loss of the ability to understand or produce language. Okay, so Broca's area, speech production, Wernicke's area, understanding speech, but this is both total loss. Okay, results from widespread left hemisphere lesions affecting all of the speech zones. And the prognosis for language recovery is poor, and this aphasia is often accompanied by other neurological impairments. So let's look at this graphically. Okay, on the left-hand side, speaking a heard word. Okay, let's start with number one. So primary auditory cortex, that's how the physical energy got in, right? Through our ears, we heard a word. So processed by the primary auditory cortex. That goes then to Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is the understanding of speech. That is then sent to Broca's area for speech production. And then from 4 to 5 goes to motor cortex, so you can repeat what you just heard. Okay, does that make sense? On the right-hand side, speaking a written word. Okay, so now instead of speaking a heard word, this is speaking a written word. So now the physical energy is something that you see. It's coming in through the eyes, processed at the primary visual cortex. The primary visual cortex then sends that to the angular gyrus. Okay, the angular gyrus sends that to Wernicke's area, then Wernicke's area to Broca's area to the motor cortex, so that you can speak that word. Okay. So that's the process here for Broca's area and Wernicke's area. And when we see loss, which is an aphasia, we know which area is being affected. The motor theory of language proposes that anterior and posterior left hemisphere language zones are motor control systems, just like we said, it goes up to that motor cortex. The systems are involved in both production and perception of complex motions that produce speech. Users of sign language employ the same neural mechanisms that speakers do, and following comparable brain injury exhibit the same aphasias. This is fascinating, guys. So an individual who is watching another individual's sign to them, right? So they have to interpret those signs, right? That is the interpretation of speech. So that is processed in Wernicke's area, just like an individual listening to somebody. Okay? If you are signing to another person, that is production of speech. And we see the area of Broca's area light up, okay? Because that is producing speech. Transcranial magnetic stimulation can be used to simulate a lesion by disrupting neural activity for up to an hour. And what do we see? Well, it showed that speech perception activates regions of speech production, supporting the motor theory of speech. And anterior parts of Broca's area are involved in the meaning of words, while posterior parts are important for speech sound patterns. So now the research is taking us to specific areas of Broca's area, and specific areas of Wernicke's area, and how they might be broken down into their functionality. And then we have dyslexia, okay, a learning disorder here, mild to severe difficulty with reading attributed to brain impairment. We have acquired dyslexia, which is sudden dyslexia in adults after injury, usually to the left hemisphere. Okay, that is going to be different than your developmental dyslexia. I also broke it down into types here. So in deep dyslexia, patients read a word as another word with a related meaning. So where's what is the issue here? Well, the lexical procedure is lost. Okay, the ability to store information about words is lost, so they can't sound out unfamiliar words. In surface dyslexia, the patient is restricted to the regular sound rules of letters. Phonetic procedure is now lost. In this one, the ability to sound things out, okay? And they cannot recognize words. Okay? Developmental dyslexia is unique to written languages and is not a cognitive deficit. The problem seems to lie in connecting reading with ancient brain mechanisms for speech. It has been associated with neurological abnormalities. Perhaps dyslexia is a deficit of phonological processing rather than of sensory motor processing. So we're looking at here, dyslexia might be an issue with the interpretation of sound, okay? The sounds of speech. That's what these individuals are having a hard time. Also, some studies have shown about the delay in processing, okay? So these individuals might process auditory physical energy at a slower level. So that makes it harder for them to read, right? And we do know that there is a genetic component here.